it took me a really long time to feel comfortable showing anything, and like I still am that way. Like I have an Instagram with like 2 posts, and like people are constantly like, "What do you make?" And I'm like, "Don't worry about it. Like, I'm not gonna show you." In that way, I've like felt like tremendous patience from the people around me, and I don't know, people are willing to let me just sort of like be a hermit in a corner and like show things every now and again, and it feels great. Growing up, I got a lot of exposure to like mostly performing arts, like a lot of theater and a lot of dance. And like I remember like seeing opera when I was a little kid. I loved the scope of it and how grand it was. And I went to these operas that were like sort of designed for kids. And so like I think we would have like props to like swing around and they would come through the audience. And so I loved it. Like I was very shy and quiet, but I feel like when I was there, I would sort of feel a bit more free to let loose. Horses specifically are loaded with like so much stuff of like passion and like desire and like all these things that are like really fraught of like wealth and like war and violence, but also like sex and like kink and like horse girls and like orgasms. Not that that specifically applies to me. And so I was like interested in using them and like also just like play. So I was interested in using them and like thinking about all those like really big, grandiose and like fraught things and how I could like work with it or undercut them. I definitely think of them as like portraits of desire or of like kink or like kink aesthetic. And also like in the same hand, like they're like hobby horses, they're toys. So of like play and childishness and sort of the exuberance that comes with that. But also they're like dead. And so I guess like I'm thinking about like comedy and like horror as genres, and like both of those are not historically respected. And like I'm really interested in art that is like sort of abject and macabre and also funny. And like a lot of my favorite movies are horror films, and I feel like so many amazing like slasher movies and like B horror movies were made, and like the form like became a way because they weren't taken seriously for artists to do like really weird, kooky stuff. And so I like kind of, I like reject the idea that funny art isn't serious, and I also sort of love that because of that assumption, then I can like sneak other things in. A lot of like the figures I make are like somewhat pathetic, but and like in some ways reprehensible, and like but that there is like a humanity to them, even if they're sort of like a butt of a joke. But I don't know, I think it like goes back to like masculinity in like all of my art, with like a sort of level of like bravado, but also like sort of just like pathetic. And like that figure to me feels like that of like riding this goofy toy with like his dick out. And I don't know, there just feels like a real impotency to it, while still being like, there's like a real pride to him. For a long time, I was like so self-conscious to make anything that felt like it was sort of showing any amount of my personality. Like it felt like in sort of revealing any amount of myself, I was leaving myself vulnerable to then have someone like pull something and like the whole thing is exposed. And so I made like really bad abstract art. And so like after a couple of years of making really horrible art that way, I think like the pendulum sort of swung, and I was like, you have to stop taking yourself so seriously, and like you have to, I don't know, like let things be more joyful and like see beauty in things that are sort of not taken seriously, and that are like bright and dumb and kitsch. I don't know, I just think there's like real power to that. And I find it very moving.
L'amour est un oiseau rebelle que nul ne peut apprivoiser. Et c'est bien en vain qu'on l'appelle, s'il lui convient de refuser. Rien n'y fait, menace ou prière, n'en parle bien, l'autre se tait. C'est l'autre que je préfère, il n'a rien dit, mais il me
I mean, I feel like with like the clothing I make, with like the underwear and the figures I make, there's a lot of like nudity and like sex and I like take all those things seriously. But I hope that it's funny to people. Like I don't want it to feel too serious, and I don't think it like is lacking for like meaning or like gravity because it's funny. And like the art that I'm attracted to is sort of negotiating that similarly. Like I read this book. The name of it is evading me, but it like has this description that I found really moving of a person who's on like public transportation in San Francisco, and he's being mugged, and it's like this really violent, sort of like debased depiction because it's just like a person being mugged by like 6 people, but like the way that it's written about is like the assailants' punches are like pillowy and their hair is like candy floss, and there's like a level of humor to it, and I think also like a way of like negotiating like the horrific violence in the world with like a level of aesthetic detail. I don't think because like the things I'm making are funny that there isn't like real emotion in them, and that like even because I'm like, or if I'm like talking about violence in a way that is like supposed to be funny, it's not to deny like the seriousness or weight of violence. I never considered myself that good at more traditional mediums. I think I would just get lost in those and be hyperfixated on like a level of perfectionism that then felt like totally devoid of like any sort of creative processing. And so then I think I sort of like forced myself to use materials that I would have to make my own process for. And like the moment that I feel competent in something, I try to like jump onto a different thing because I think I fear like what that level of competency, and I think this is shifting, but I fear like with that competency will then like come a tightness and like a lack of energy in my work that I don't want. But I think I'm sort of like unlearning that philosophy because I think I think it worked for a while, and now I don't think it's necessary, especially with like the bear that I made. Like that was by far like the most time-intensive thing I've ever made. And it felt really good to just like commit to a project and take the time and patience to plan everything out, and like to trust myself that it would work. Versus, I don't know, like a lot of the other things I make can have like a purposefully unfinished look, which I like, but I think for a long time I felt really wary of making things that felt heavily labored upon, and that like were assigned some amount of value because of that clear labor. And now like I find myself thinking that maybe it sounds less bad to me than I thought it did before. I'm thinking a lot about care in the things that I make, and I think there's like a lot of tenderness in them. And I think it also just like fits with the work that Cody's making. His studio is like on the other side of this wall, and so I feel like I've like always been inspired by Cody and his work, and I think our work feels pretty different, but I think we're both going for like more of a feeling than a polish. His show is like really tender and like really heartfelt, and there's a lot of overlap there. And just like us as people, like Cody's one of my best friends, and I think we move through the world in a lot of similar ways. It feels important for me, for at least my own art, to feel like it has an access point, and to feel, because it's such a solitary thing to like make art. At least for me, like I'm in the studio with a couple other people, but like most of the time I'm here alone, and I feel like there are a lot of things that like I've missed out on, or relationships that I don't necessarily like put the most time or effort into because I choose to be here. And so like having my art then feel like it could be some sort of a vessel for connection for other people feels important. I'm pretty quiet and can be pretty shy, and this is sort of like one of the only ways that I know how to express a lot of things that are going on in my head. And I don't know, I like need some sort of like tactile fixation. Like I can be like a pretty anxious person, and like, not to say that making like art serves as just like a fidget, but it kind of does. Like I think having my hands busy feels really healthy in like a very like parasympathetic body way. But I don't know, otherwise like I'll just get like ideas stuck in my head, and I just won't be able to stop thinking about them until I make them. Some of the most heightened like emotional experiences in my life have been looking at art or like listening to music, and I think partially because I'm not like the best communicator, and so like I'm not necessarily having those moments with like the people in my life all the time, but I think like I've experienced like real moments of transcendence and like really deep emotional gravity with other people's art and other people's music, and that like really moved me and like really changed me. And I think, not to say that I think my art necessarily does that for anyone else, but I think like the power of art to do that feels, I don't know, like I feel like I can't access it anywhere else. And that feels like really vital.